So I was thinking a little bit about when Dominik invited me what to present here that would be at the same time kind of representative of the way in which I work, which is a kind of combination or putting together, working together conceptually with philosophy and psychoanalysis, also in respect to some kind of sometimes political consequences, possible political consequences of this kind of encounter, and to do it in a way that would not be too abstract or complicated for this kind of format that we have here, this gathering. So I thought this question of the connection of repetition and ending that I was just recently working on a little bit could be a good choice, because the way I will approach it will be in some kind of also anecdotic way with examples that hopefully will make some sense or will resonate in the way that it will make it possible for you perhaps to get some further associations or ideas and so on. So repetition, of course, on the one hand, repetition is a kind of very complex philosophical notion. It is from Aristotle on via Kierkegaard, to Deleuze and so on. I mean, it is a very complex notion. It is also, on the other hand, one of the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, as the title of Lacan's famous seminar suggests, where he discusses repetition precisely as one of the four fundamental concepts. And on the other hand, of course, the topics of the end, be it the end of art, the end of history, the end of humanity or post-human, the fact that we supposedly live in the end times, this threat of total extinction, the topic of the end has a heavily charged philosophical and psychoanalytic resonances. But as I said, I will attempt to deal with these two highly charged notions in a rather anecdotic way, which I think will come perhaps across as slightly comic, but hopefully also serious, because I really don't think that comedy and serious things contradict each other. So as this is evening gathering, it's really not extremely formal, so if you can feel free to interrupt me if something is unclear or not well enough pronounced, so that we can just clarify that. So what I wanted to show or to discuss a little bit today is simply first that this thesis that there is a way of looking at the phenomenon of repetition and ending as the way in which they appear as really intrinsically related. That is to say that ending is not simply something that appears at the end of repetition, but functions more or less also as its inherent condition or in some other way. And I will look at two modalities of this inherent relationship. The first can be put under this kind of a heading saying, I can end it whenever I want. And I'm sure you are all familiar with this kind of configuration where precisely the possibility of ending something, of ending what we are doing or repeating, is the very condition that makes it possible for us to do it, to repeat it, not to end it precisely. Be it a relationship and its recurring sins or difficulties, or a bad habit, not having the strength or the will to end it strictly correlates, I would say, to the possibility of ending it, that there is nevertheless this possibility that we do it. And of course, precisely possibility is the crucial term here. It is what allows us not to act, not to end it in our case. Why bother now? It can wait, or something like this. A nice comic example of this logic is provided in one of the episodes of Monty Python's movie, The Meaning of Life. I'm sure you know it. If you remember the episode which starts with the famous Every Sperm is Sacred song, performed by this Catholic family with comically huge number of children. If you've seen the movie, there's this kind of musical beginning. There are like, I don't know, 50 children that all sing "Every Sperm is Sacred." And so we first see this, and then the perspective shifts to a Protestant couple, observing them, these Catholics, through the window, and commenting on those bloody Catholics, as the husband puts it. And then the wife, the Protestant wife, asks, but why do they have so many children? Because every time they have sexual intercourse, they have to have a baby, responds the husband. But of course the wife is confused. But it's the same with us, she says. We've got 2 children and we had sexual intercourse twice. But that's not the point, retorts the husband. We could have had it any time we wanted. And then the scene goes on in this same sense, and the husband again brags about how their religion allows them to use condoms, even such that kind of enhance pleasure. And again, the wife asks, have you got one? Like, wishfully think. And he says, well, no, but I can go down the road anytime I want and walk into Harris's and hold my head up high and say in a loud, steady voice, Henry, I want you to sell me a condom. In fact, today I will have a French tickler, for I'm a Protestant. This is kind of a great Protestant speech. And then, of course, the wife goes, well, but why don't you? So there is this kind of, it's a kind of a the way it's done, it's very funny and comic representation precisely of this, how the possibility to, in this sense, to stop the puritanic life or something like this can be precisely what makes us perpetuate it, get involved with it and perpetuate it. And of course the fact that the end is structured here as a possibility, as this kind of potentiality, makes also this interrogation, this anecdotic interrogation, part of a larger and also more, if you want, philosophical one. For example, in his recently published book, I'm not sure if this book exists in German, I know the English version, but it's written by a German philosopher, a young philosopher, Frank Ruda. Abolishing Freedom is the title. In this book, he takes up this question in relation to the issue of freedom, for example. He argues that freedom as possibility, as capacity, exemplified, for instance, in the freedom of choice, is precisely the best antidote to actual freedom. This is why abolishing freedom is kind of his project. Freedom as possibility, as capacity, is a specific kind, specific way of understanding freedom, and it has become actually a signifier of oppression more than anything else, which then Ruda proposes to counteract with what he calls comic fatalism. And he formulates several slogans of such fatalism, some of which directly evoke precisely the idea of the end, which is why I think it's interesting to bring in this context. They suggest that a way out of this freedom as oppression is to act as if the end has already happened. So I will just quote 3 examples, 3 slogans that he proposes. Act as if the apocalypse has already happened, or act as if you were dead, or act as if everything you were, as if everything were always already lost. So we can say, if you want perhaps to go on in this sense, if you want to end a bad relationship, act as if you have already ended it. Or here this works even better, I guess, if you want to stop smoking, for instance, and this example will be with us all through, act as if you have already stopped, and declare perhaps retroactively that this cigarette you smoked, I don't know, half an hour ago was actually your last cigarette. However, I think it's quite crucial to note here that when the mode of possibility or this potentiality when we accentuating that the mode of possibility or potentiality is the main problem in this kind of configuration of freedom, the understanding of freedom as capacity, as potentiality, we should also be, I think, careful to immediately add the following. Namely, that once the possibility enters the game and structures it in this way, we should actually resist understanding or presenting what is at stake simply in terms of possibility versus actuality, actual action, because there is a trap there. We should resist presenting it in terms of the opposition precisely between a possibility to do something and its realization. For I think this is precisely how freedom as oppression actually works in practice. It works following what is called in psychoanalysis the logic of the superego, and which was, I think, most concisely defined by Zizek as a kind of reversal of this, famous Kantian, you must, therefore you can. You must do something, so therefore you can do it. It's reversal into you can, therefore you must. So possibilities are to be taken. They are to be realized by all means and at any price. You can do it, therefore you must do it. This is really the superego logic at its purest, and this is also why, for example, one of the famous sayings by Lacan is that superego imperative is actually an imperative to enjoy and not to restrain from all enjoyment. So the culture or economy of possibilities is not suffocating simply because there are so many possibilities that we have to choose, for instance, from, I don't know, so many different products and so on, but because we are supposed not to miss out of any of them. Of course, a person who just sits at home relishing in the idea of all the possibilities and opportunities that capitalism has to offer and doing nothing to realize them is not the kind of person that this kind of system needs. What we are expected to do is to realize as many possibilities as possible. But precisely never to question the very framework of these possibilities as possibilities and of what makes them possibilities, which is probably precisely where actual freedom has to be situated, not simply in the actual realization of these possibilities, but rather in a kind of unscrewing the very framework based on the idea of freedom as possibility to be realized, and the framework that actually decides what is possible and what is completely off limit. You hear these examples very often lately, how it is quite interesting. We are told all the time that everything is possible. We live in a society where there should be no such thing as impossibility, and yet the smallest suggestion of some kind of a social change that would imply that would have certain consequences is immediately shut down as this is completely impossible, unimaginable. At the same time, we can go, I don't know, to Mars and do things that are quite incredible. And so to make this point perhaps even more clear, I would like to add that go back to this Protestant couple from The Meaning of Life, and we see that they are certainly not the ideal consumers. They are not caught up, we could also say, in this superego imperative of enjoyment. What they and our reaction to them expose, I think, is precisely the risk of a swift conclusion, this hasty conclusion, which consolidates precisely the capitalist logic, to call it this way. Namely, the following conclusion. Were they to act on these possibilities they have, buy a condom and have sex very often, they would have been really free. This is the trap. This is precisely not the step to make. In other words, the problem is not that they don't act, although they could have, but rather that if they were to act, this act would have already been caught up in this logic of freedom as realization of possibilities. Logic on which they themselves and their freedom have very little influence. But the way their example functions in the movie is there, I think, used in a slightly different way. Precisely, it is there to illustrate the logic of the relationship between repetition and ending, which I started with, namely that they can go on practicing their Puritanism because they believe they can end whenever they want. So if I return to the beginning of this digression, to the economy, psychological economy, little arrangements with oneself at work between our repeating something and the possibility of ending it, because there is certainly an economy here, and an economy that allows me, for instance, to go on smoking, while the possibility of quitting is here just in order to help me precisely to smoke. And just ask yourself how many people would, for instance, start smoking if the state, instead of putting warnings, threats, and disgusting images on cigarette packs, would pass a law stating that if you start smoking, you are not allowed to quit, ever, the end. So once you start, you commit to it for life. So you see, this is precisely to make you feel how this kind of possibility to end it is very much into the very act of repeating it, part of it. So the structure that we are dealing with in this first mode of the relation between repetition and ending could thus be defined as follows. We are infinitely approaching the end as the limit, putting it off. Yet this limit is not simply there at the end of it all, it seems to, as it seems to be, but is, as possibility, as potentiality, also the very precondition of the movement of repetition. It is what structures it in a certain way. We could also say that it is what buys us the freedom to enjoy whatever we are doing. It structures also the enjoyment of ending it. So there is an economy at stake here, but it is not the only possible kind. The other mode of the relationship between repetition and ending, which I will present now in the second and a little bit the longer part of my talk, is perhaps even more interesting. And this other logic, we could put it under the following second heading. This is the end. This is the last time I do it. And in order to exemplify this logic, I will introduce a literary reference, namely a novel by Italo Svevo. Perhaps some of you surely know it. La conscienza di Zeno, Zeno's conscience is English translation. I'm not sure what is the German translation. It was written in 1923 by this Italo Svevo. This is pseudonym actually for Aaron Ettore Schmidt, who was
the title again?
Coscienza di Zeno. And I think in the English translation, there are actually two English translations. One is Zeno's Conscience, and the other is Zeno's Confessions, which is a little bit closer to the original, because it is actually his confessions, his memoirs, that he has supposedly, allegedly, of course, written while being in analysis. I will tell you a little bit about the structure. So this is a very interesting literary figure. He was also a businessman, and he wrote some things. He was living in Trieste, and he was a close friend of James Joyce, who actually is responsible for the deserved fame of this novel, his most famous novel, Zeno's Consciousness, novel which, when it was first published, passed very much unnoticed, and then became famous because Joyce was kind of supporting it and making propaganda for it. So this it's a really great novel. I recommend it. It's a vast novel, but I just am mostly interested in one thread that goes through it. And as I said, this novel wonderfully depicts another possible kind of economy at stake in the relationship between repeating and ending. And the key word here, to continue with the example of cigarettes, which are also at the center of the novel precisely, is not as before sometime, but not just now, I will quit smoking, but this cigarette right here and now is the last cigarette I will smoke. The ultima sigaretta. This is a kind of recurring slogan. As Zeno remarks at some point, to kind of better underline one's inner resolve, the determination to quit, to end it, one likes to end smoking together with the end of something else. For example, the end of the month, the end of the year. There is this kind of interesting dimension of repetition pertaining to the ending itself. The end should be repeated in order to really end something. Okay, so of course, nothing tastes as good as the ultima sigaretta. As Zeno himself puts it at some point, I believe the taste of a cigarette is more intense when it is your last. Obviously. And the fact that it is the last cigarette adds something to its taste. It makes it the best cigarette ever, and it makes you really enjoy it. So of course you can see the idea or the ideal would be to think of every cigarette as you smoke as your last one and enjoy it accordingly. However, and here is the catch, in order for this to work, you really have to believe that it is your last one, that it is the end. In other words, you have to be a neurotic, as Zeno, the main character of the novel, certainly is. And the economy at stake here is not that of this kind of little arrangement with oneself. In terms of the economy of enjoyment, you cannot help yourself here by acting as if this were your last cigarette. You cannot say to yourself, I will act as if this is my last cigarette, and this way I will get to fully enjoy it. You want to stop, you do everything in your power to stop. And Zeno really goes to some extent here, including having himself kidnapped and locked into a hospital. I mean, there are these kind of very great comic scenes. But you end up accumulating one last cigarette after another. At least this is his case. You end up infinitely repeating the end precisely, and this is the structure that I'm getting. Here, what we have is precisely repeating the end again and again. And enjoying it rather against your will, we could also say. Strictly speaking, the economy here is unconscious economy, or even more precisely, it is the economy of the unconscious, we could even say. So, of course, no wonder then that Zeno's Conscience is actually also a novel about psychoanalysis. So the novel consists of Zeno's memoirs, in which his obsession with smoking and his being in analysis for it play a prominent part. And as we read in the preface, allegedly written by his analyst, to whom Zeno sent his memoirs at some point when he decided to stop more or less the analysis, the analyst decides to publish the memoirs in revenge, as he puts it, because Zeno has suspended his treatment. So there is this kind of intrinsic and interesting way that the whole thing is presented and built up. So, differently from the previous configuration in which the end as possibility was inherent to the repetition, what is at stake here is rather that repetition is inherent to the end. There is something about the end itself that drives the repetition, and repetition is essentially repetition of the end. And perhaps this is just by way of a short digression. I think we could say that what is at stake in this famous Hegelian thesis about the end of art is actually structured precisely following this mode of repetition, namely as an unceasing repetition of the end. And I'm here, I cannot develop this in more detail, but for those who are interested, there is a very interesting point that Giorgio Agamben develops in this book, The Man Without Content, which basically takes seriously Hegel's claim that art has exhausted perhaps its spiritual vocation and kind of turned to philosophy. But as Agamben argues, this is not to say that Hegel proclaimed the death of art, as this is often interpreted. Rather, he proclaimed the kind of indefinite continuation of art in what Hegel called a kind of self-annulling or self-annihilating mode. This indefinite continuation in self-annulling mode does in fact correspond to what I'm describing here as this repetition of the end. The art ends again and again with every significant, precisely new artistic project. Or as Agamben puts it, I think very nicely, art does not die, but having become a self-annihilating nothing, eternally survives itself. Its twilight can last more than the totality of its day, because its death is precisely its inability to die. Okay, but this is really just an aside. If I return to Zeno, so he is in analysis for this obsession with smoking and quitting, and he has lots of other problems, and he is also very skeptical about the way his psychoanalysis is going, about what it can achieve, as well as about his doctor. But this doctor seems to get at least some things right. And one of them is that actually Zeno's disease was not the smoking itself, as Zeno thinks, but precisely his obsession with ending it. Or rather, that smoking and quitting are actually one and the same passion for him. So that the real question is not why does he smoke so much, but rather why does he want to stop, to end it so badly. So the core of Zeno's pathology, in all its comic dimension, rather lies here, and not simply in his smoking, but in this kind of passionate attempt to end. So at some point, this doctor tries a new strategy, telling Zeno, and I'm really going very briefly through this, telling Zeno that there is no reason for him to stop. A brief quote, these are his words, says Zeno, smoking wasn't bad for me, and if I were convinced it was harmless, it would really be so. So then the doctor also explains, kind of gives him explanation why he thinks he's bad. It's something to do with the guilt about his father and so on. This is not really important for us here. The point that I would like to emphasize is simply that this doctor's suggestion that smoking isn't bad for him, what it does is that actually it aims at disrupting both possible economies involved in the relationship between repetition and ending that I'm discussing here. So not only the urgency, the imperative to stop immediately, but also the perspective of the possibility to stop at some later point. So what this doctor imposes upon Zeno with his intervention is the absolute freedom to smoke, which throws out not only the imperative to end, but also the cause that structures the framework of smoking in terms of possibility of ending it. So there is no end in sight, no end to repeat, nor to infinitely approach. So this changes the configuration radically, and, as it could be expected, affects Zeno badly. He goes on smoking like a chimney for a while, and then he concludes, the freedom to smoke, this is a quote, the freedom to smoke whenever I liked finally depressed me totally. I had a good idea. I went to Dr. Paoli. Now this Dr. Paoli is a true doctor, a physician, and Zeno desperately wants him to find some physical cause of his neurotic state, of his mal-being, a real disease instead of an imaginary one, as he puts it. But this Dr. Paoli is also not of much help. He finds no physical disease that would relieve Zeno. But then, to cut a long story short, Zeno eventually finds a way out of his ordeal, namely he never returns to analysis, and hence first effectively ends it. Not in any solemn way, he just postpones going there, and after a while he realizes that he has ended it. And in doing this, he also stops smoking. And he says, I quote one sentence, "I have finally succeeded in returning to my sweet habits and stopped smoking. I'm already much better since I have been able to abolish the freedom that foolish doctor chose to grant me." I really like the consonances here. He uses, at least the English translation, the very term abolishing freedom. And we have it, like this Ruda's point most literally, abolishing freedom can have a most liberating effect. And it is kind of a nice example to add to his list, perhaps. But as you can see, what happens in this abolishing freedom is precisely a kind of rejection of abstract freedom. Because I think in this case, abstract freedom is precisely what is articulated in this quasi-alternative between smoking and quitting. I think the doctor's suggestion, "you are free to smoke," efficiently exposes the limits of the abstract freedom, in this case, the impossibility masked by the false alternative or choice between smoking and not smoking. For this choice is clearly not what is at stake for Zeno. He's repeating the very, you could say, all through he's repeating the very failure of this alternative to capture what is at stake for him. The imperative to smoke and the imperative to quit smoking come from the same source, from the same structural place, and they actually kind of protect each other, enhance each other. And in a similar way, we could say the abstract freedom as freedom of choice is precisely the very form of existence of an imperative. I don't know, the most vulgar example would be the freedom to choose between different products is the form of existence of the imperative to buy, precisely. So there is always this other side of this choice. So at the end, Zeno believes that it was not the therapy, but the fact that he ended it that finally cured him. And of course, to some extent, he is quite right. But we could also say that this, far from kind of casting a very dubious light on the practice of analysis, the fact that he was miraculously cured the moment he stopped going to analysis is perhaps could be interpreted as a showcase of a successful analysis. This would be one possible reading. We could say that Zeno's obsession with ending, the idea that he has to stop smoking, which, and not the smoking itself, was the core of his pathology, has been successfully transformed into transference neurosis. You know, this is this Freudian notions, very well known, I guess. Transference neurosis is simply defined as an artificial illness which takes place as a direct continuation of the original illness with all its characteristics, except that since it is played out in relationship to the analyst and in the conditions of transference, it is entirely accessible to analytic intervention. So basically, really simply put, the idea is we have the present time of something that might have happened a long time ago, but in this sense it is no longer possible to intervene into it. But there is some kind of eternal present and actuality of the symptoms when they are played out in relationship to the analyst, and there one is actually able to intervene, and this intervention in the present can have the effect of changing the past as well, so to say, ideally. And perhaps we could say this is what happens to Zeno. He stops his analysis, and as if most naturally, he also stops smoking, or rather he stops ending it, and hence stops doing it. He ends smoking by ending something else, namely the analysis, something else to which his passion for ending became attached. He could not have ended it directly, simply stopping, but or simply by fully carrying through his original attempt to end it. There is a certain discontinuity here, and repetition, like ending it with something else, is precisely the way this discontinuity is registered and the way it really works then. It is not, the ending is not just the logical conclusion of something. There is a certain scission, there is a certain break, there is a certain continuity which actually enables the ending to be an actual ending. So this would be one possible reading. However, and I'm approaching the final part, the conclusion. However, Zeno's memoirs continue, and the concluding part of the novel introduces a new perspective which actually forces us to ask whether this is really the right reading, the one that I proposed, or is it rather that Zeno's ending his analysis was a kind of a showcase of acting out and not a successful analysis. Now, acting out is another psychoanalytic concept which is actually easy to explain. It refers to a way in which the subject kind of performs, stages the core of his or her symptoms in a really flagrant way. It's kind of obviously what she or he does, but without noticing that this is precisely what he or she did. Just to give you an example, in one of his essays, Lacan gives a very nice example. It's a very funny one. It involves an acting out of a patient. It's not one of his patients. He's actually criticizing the way these ego analyses are being conducted. And it seems that there was this guy, this professor or something like this, who was obsessed with plagiarism. So he wasn't able to publish any book because whenever he started writing, he was completely obsessed that he's stealing ideas of others. And whatever he did, he already finished the manuscript, but then supposedly discovered in a library a book by another professor who already said everything that he said and so on. So this was the reason why he came to analysis. And this analyst, who was not a Lacanian, but some kind of whatever ego analyst, he thought he found an explanation. And this is one way that Lacanian psychoanalysis is distinguished from this common notion that explanation is enough, that we fully explain the symptoms and then they will disappear. No, this is not how it functions. Anyway, so this doctor at some point explained his theory to the patient about why this obsession, and the doctor actually believed that he cured him, that he is now okay. And immediately after he received this explanation, the patient reacted to it with the following remark. He said, "You know, every noon when I leave here, the doctor's office, before lunch, before returning to my office, I walk through this street, a street well known for its small but attractive restaurants, and I look at the menus in the windows. In one of the restaurants, I usually find my preferred dish, fresh brains." See, this is a very nice example of acting out. So he's actually there looking at fresh brains, and neither him nor, it seems, the doctor actually sees what is being said here. That this is not in no way that he's kind of cured or whatever, he's acting out. So the fact that the subject does not at all hear what he's saying here clearly indicates for Lacan that the core of repression, Verdrängung, remains fully operative. And as a matter of fact, the concluding part of the memoirs of a now supposedly cured Zeno contains a very similar configuration. Namely, Zeno reflects at the end, this is the very ending, on life in general and on the way it is heading, and he predicts, it's a kind of philosophical speech, he predicts that sickness and the sick will prosper and flourish with the help of what he calls devices, machines, devices existing outside our body. Devices, he writes, are bought, sold, and often stolen, and man becomes increasingly shrewd and weaker. His first devices seemed extensions of man's arm and couldn't be effective without its strength, but by now the device no longer has any relation to the limb, and it is the device that creates sickness, he writes, abandoning the law of the strongest, and so we lost healthful selection. So, and then he goes on to suggest that it would take much more than psychoanalysis to cure this sickness, this kind of ontological sickness of life. Actually, it would take no less than an unheard of catastrophe. It would take no less than the end of the world. This is the concluding paragraph of the novel. It's actually a very beautiful paragraph. I will simply read it to you. Perhaps through an unheard of catastrophe produced by devices, we will return to health. When poison gases no longer suffice, an ordinary man in the secrecy of a room in this world will invent an uncomparable explosive, compared to which the explosives currently in existence will be considered harmless toys. And another man, also ordinary, but a bit sicker than others, will steal this explosive and will climb up at the center of the earth to set it on the spot where it can have the maximum effect. There will be an enormous explosion that no one will hear. And the earth, once again a nebula, will wander through the heavens free of parasites and sickness. This is the last sentence. So, and I think this indeed seems like an illustrious acting out in respect to Zeno's inaugural obsession with cigarette sickness and health. And we could also say that the fact that he might be right and this will happen at some point, the earth will get destroyed, changes nothing about this fact that this is actually a nice acting out. So Zeno's obsession with health, sickness, and ending it reappears here on a wholly new scale, on a kind of universal scale, the scale of the universe. But what I think is particularly interesting about this conclusion is how perfectly it resonates, how well it resonates with much of what we could call the kind of cultural or intellectual climate of our times. This theme that I mentioned at the beginning of the end of total extinction, or at least of the disappearance of what we call human beings, has an imposing presence, at least in philosophy and in some other, of course, ecology and so on. The fact that there are real concerns, that there are real causes of concern, in no way contradicts the, I would say, phantasmatic character of many of these representations of the end. And what I mean by this is that the idea of even the most radical, definitive, irreversible end still serves as a framework through which we contemplate and interpret, of course, our present reality. And it often serves as means of ideological consolidation, obviously. It serves first to give us an idea of just how much is needed to change our present reality, that it provides a spectacular answer to the question, what has to end in order for our present troubles to end, so to say. And from there we can have our pick. We can choose. We can either decide that we prefer nothing to change, since change and catastrophe are one and the same in this presentation, or else we can find consolidation in the fact that it will all be taken care of anyway by this catastrophe, which will free us of everything. So, and then something new perhaps can begin, and this is a kind of optimist twist, the kind of silver lining sometimes added to these catastrophe scenarios as potential scenarios of emancipation. And you know, perhaps this reminds me of what Fred Jameson said in, I think, in one of his texts, that nowadays people can much more easily imagine the Earth being hit by a comet than a kind of radical transformation of the social, political, but also economic coordinates of our daily life, or our more daily, ordinary life. So as if things will never really change from within, only a radical catastrophe can save us from ourselves. which is also why there is a significant ambivalence, of course, surrounding this expectation of such an end. And many choose to cheer the prospect of some kind of catastrophe, the prospect of precisely this kind of total extinction or whatever. And I'm really now concluding, it is perhaps here that we should fully apply Frank Ruda's principle and ingenious formula, and to say, but wait, it has already happened, at least once. We don't even need to pretend to act as if it's already happened. The Earth has once been but a nebula, completely free of sickness and of humans and of their problems and devices. And look where this had led us, had led it. In other words, you see, I mean, it's a crazy suggestion, but to suggest precisely what if this apocalyptic scenario, this perspective of radical extinction, is perhaps too optimistic precisely in this way. What if, in fact, nothing, not even the prospect of total extinction, can guarantee a way of a very precise predicament that we are living in now? There is no guarantee that this scenario can not be repeated, or that indeed what we are living today is not already a repetition of it. To say that very often the prospect of catastrophe as a typical fantasy scenario does not mean that the catastrophe is a fantasy. In other words, we have to distinguish kind of the actual possibility that it will all end up in some sort of planetary catastrophe from the end of our present troubles as future possibility precisely. For very much like Zeno, we seem to be delegating the change, the end of our troubles to another end, which will take care of it all in one go. And of course, to be sure, this kind of orientation in thinking is to be taken very seriously, for it is a real symptom of an utter precisely impotence that we experience as social and political subjects to intervene in the course of events and in their structuring. And this impotence is quite real. It is not, certainly not about us being too lazy to actually do something about it here and now. But the fact that this impotence is real and to some extent structural should not let us confuse it with the kind of absolute necessity which could only be dealt with in the form of the end of it all, so to say. So perhaps this is just kind of a comic suggestion to end. Perhaps we could conclude by adding to Ruda's list of these comically fatalist attitudes yet another one. It would go some way like this: the world will surely end, but it won't be the end of our troubles. Okay, thank you.